Welcome to the Karuna Training podcast. This episode is called 4 Ways to Love with Miriam, myself, and my guest, Nauko. My name is Miriam. I use she, her pronouns. I live on Techope land, Ho-Chunk land, named Techope by the Ho-Chunk people. The conventional name is Madison, Wisconsin. And my guest, Nauko.
Thank you, Miriam. So I'm Nauko. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm doing this podcast from the unceded territory of the Lenape people, or New York City. And I am one of the lead teachers for Karuna, as is Miriam. I was part of the first cycle of Karuna Training in North America, which was held in 2014, where I met Miriam. So it's been 10 years now. We've known each other. And we've been on the Karuna journey as participants, as facilitators for other cycles, and now as teachers. And I'm really excited to do this podcast with her.
Same. Wonderful. And we're also going to be lead teachers in the next cycle that's going to happen in North America, which will be starting this autumn. So if you've been interested in doing Karuna training, you've watched some of our lives, attended some of our shorter programs, go to our website and find out a little more about the basic training cycle that's going to be coming up.
Yeah. So I do want to start by just talking about how this podcast came about. And it really arose from some questions we had about love. So we're doing this podcast in February. So we have Valentine's Day this month, which is the day of love. But in Buddhism, we really don't talk much about love. In fact, the word love is rarely used in the teachings. So the question we had was, does this mean love is not important in Buddhism? Well, it turns out that that's not true at all. But before we get into that, I just want to talk about the word love itself and how it's used in the English language. So this is something that I've always questioned about. English compared to other languages is slightly different. In English, we may say things like, I love ice cream, but we may also use, I love my child, or I love my spouse. So when we know that the word that we use for love is applied to our favorite food, which is actually different than the love we have for our loved ones, both in terms of quality and quantity. It's actually very different. And yet we use the same word, right? We use the word love for both expressions. And this was always perplexing to me because it really lacks precision about the actual feeling that we have. And I think that in Buddhism, what we call love in relationships is actually described much more precisely, much more in detail. And it's really broken down. And I think this is what many Buddhist teachings do anyway. They break things down, right? Because love comes in all different flavors and they have different energies. And it's not just one thing. So in Buddhism, we really get into the different qualities of love. So today, we're going to talk about one of the classical teachings from Buddhism called the Four Immeasurables. So this teaching is also called the Four Immeasurables. This teaching has other different names, such as Four Limitless Ones, or the Four Sublime States. That sounds all very exotic. But the expression that most resonates with me that I've heard used is the Four Faces of Love, or the Four Flavors of Love, or the Four Elements of Love. And in Sanskrit, this teaching is called the Four Brahma Viharas, which literally means the dwelling place of Brahma. And Brahma is the name of a Hindu god with four faces. And it's said that he dwelled in these four loves. So this teaching is really about the four flavors of love that already resides in us. There are qualities in us already that are fundamental to being human. And they're specifically loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And we'll talk more about each one of these in this podcast. But you could sort of think of them as the heart having 4 expressions of love that are unlimited and unconditional. And in Karuna terms, we could even say that these are the 4 potencies of the heart.
Beautiful. Thank you, Naoko. Most folks, if they're familiar with this practice, so we're having a conversation first at this podcast, and then a couple weeks later we'll have a practice podcast that will come out as well, where we'll guide you through this practice. And the most common way that people talk about this practice, the 4 potencies, the 4 flavors, the 4 faces, is to simply call it metta or Maitri practice, METTA, or Maitri, MAITRI. Metta is from Pali, Maitri is from Sanskrit. And at the same time, it's good to note that that word specifically, metta Maitri, points to just the first, loving kindness, points to just the first. Loving friendliness or benevolence or care are some other names that are given to this first metta Maitri. The full practice includes also karuna, which is compassion, as Naoko was saying, compassion. Sanskrit word is karuna, which is what Karuna Training is named after. Upekkha, which is equanimity. And then mudita, which is sympathetic, joy. And you'll notice sometimes we'll swap the order of sympathetic, joy, and equanimity, and that's just depending on the tradition. Usually we start with loving kindness and compassion, and the other 2 can get swapped around. We do work with these qualities in Karuna Training, in part so that we can really explore the facets of compassion, right? So even though compassion is one of the facets of love, these are all aspects of compassion. Love and compassion are very close together in terms of deep care. And one of the things that we practice, one of our main practices in Karuna Training, is called Maitri, space awareness. So that same word, Maitri, loving kindness, space awareness. And the idea is that as we're working with the energy of emotion, we need to have a skillful relationship with the energy of that emotion. The energy flows through space, and each of the emotions and these states, these 4 faces, are tied to the elements and tied to different ways of understanding how our relationships work. So being able to navigate that universe of our emotional experience and energy, being able to have an understanding of loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic, joy, and equanimity really helps us navigate the emotional level of our experience.
Yeah, and that we talked a lot about love and kindness, and that brings us to another question we had when thinking about this podcast. And that question was, why do we stop at love and kindness? As Miriam said, Maitri or Metta or loving kindness practice is quite common, but we don't often hear about the other qualities as much. And while it's true that there's more compassion practice recently, just as a response to the times that we're living in, with so much suffering and conflicts around the world and in our country, but we don't really hear about sympathetic joy or equanimity practice as much. And so I started thinking, why is that? And if you think about metta as the wish for happiness, I think we can all agree that everyone wants to be happy, right? It's the basic goodwill that wishes the well-being of ourselves. It doesn't matter your gender, your age, your race, your religion, sexuality. Everyone, deep down in our hearts, all have a wish for true happiness. And we don't just have this wish for ourselves, but for others, because seeing other people happy makes us happy. So this is the wish that we can direct to others, and it's also the basis for the other flavors of love. So we're really touching into something that's quite universal when we talk about loving kindness. We can say we all have a sort of a basic human need for happiness.
Yeah, and so basic human need, I love how you talk about that, is this kind of more accessible place that we can see, like, oh, yes, this is something that I can relatively easily say, like, I want others to be happy. I want myself to be happy. I think the reason why compassion can be a little bit trickier, on the one hand, we don't want others to suffer. That would be similar to happiness. But real compassion practice, when we're actually really looking at compassion, it means feeling with someone. So feeling their suffering, relating to their suffering. And we want to relate to other people's happiness, but we don't so much want to relate to their suffering. It's not as pleasant of an experience. And I found teaching this practice over time as well that we really believe that there's a limited amount of compassion, right? So we have expressions like compassion fatigue. People sort of feel like, oh, I don't have enough compassion for that person. And that's where the translation of this practice as the limitless ones is so helpful for me to remember that these qualities are actually limitless. Our access to them, our ability to access and express them may feel limited. That doesn't mean it is limited. And certainly the amount of bandwidth that we have for taking in the news may feel limited, but that doesn't mean that our compassion is limited. It just means that we need to build resilience, or what Karuna Training teacher Melissa Moore calls our intensity capacity, so that we can take in that information. And recently I've been reflecting, I moved house for the first time in 20 years, which if you sort of Google, like, what are the top 10 stressors? Most surveys will say, like, moving house is up there with divorce, job change, et cetera, right? It's really freaking stressful, in case you haven't moved recently. And I also am really in touch with, attuned to, paying attention to what's happening in Palestine and people being genocided there. And with a move, especially, it's really not hard for me to say, like, I need compassion around this. Like, I need compassion from others. I need self-compassion around the move. It's not easy. I recognize that it's not the same as being driven from my land, as being genocided or ethnically cleansed. I know they're not the same thing. And there is enough compassion for me to feel that and ask that of others who are resourced, and also to still have compassion for people who are being oppressed. And I think that's something that we often somehow subconsciously believe, that people who are suffering less don't deserve compassion, that there's a limited quantity. I'm not saying that I should take up as much bandwidth on media with my moving stress. I'm so glad that, information's getting out there about Sudan and the Congo as well. But there is a quality of that compassion and its limitlessness, that when I can believe in that, I can remember that caring for me and caring for others really helps actually feed my well, rather than deplete some large well of compassion that's out there. So we can hold both and not have a competitive quality around compassion.
I think that's really well said. And I really like that example of your personal situation of moving, and also looking at the suffering in Palestine or any other parts of the world. And I do want to just mention equanimity, which is the other one that doesn't really get talked about, sometimes translated as spaciousness or freedom. Is probably the least understood of all the four qualities of love. And sometimes it's misunderstood as even being indifferent or being impartial. But it's really more about our capacity to accommodate everything without being attached to or affected by them. And it's very similar to all-encompassing space. And different schools of Buddhist practice teach about equanimity a little bit differently as well. And I think the most common is how it acts as a kind of support and a balancing factor for the other three. So, for example, how we respond to situations with friendliness or compassion or joy depends on our minds and hearts to be relaxed and alert enough to have enough equanimity. And that will allow us to actually stay connected to our goodwill that's balanced and in harmony with our original intention. So, for example, equanimity balances loving kindness by allowing love to be expressed in a way that's without attachment and without conditions. right? And then when working with compassion, we may encounter some suffering that's really difficult for us to stay present with. And in those times, we can actually fall back on equanimity to avoid creating more suffering for ourselves or more agony or turmoil. And instead, rely on equanimity to help channel our energy in a way that actually allows us to actually be of help. And equanimity can also support joy so that we don't fall into this kind of elated states where we actually become ungrounded. Right? So equanimity allows us to be fully present, but also respond appropriately with a balanced view, without a preference for any real result or state, or become susceptible to any extremes. And in some other Buddhist schools, equanimity is actually taught as the first of the four immeasurables. And the thought there is that equanimity arises through the awareness that we cultivate in our mindfulness practice. So you start with equanimity, and you then talk about loving kindness, compassion, and joy.
I love when you mentioned that. I hadn't encountered that before. And when you mentioned it, that felt really intuitively right to me, because we mentioned that they're tied to the elements, and equanimity is tied to earth. So it's like a feeling of grounding in equanimity as we go through the others. There's real benefit in putting them in any order, but I really appreciate that description of putting equanimity first. And just to say, to touch back, because I hadn't mentioned this earlier, that loving kindness is tied to water, and compassion is tied to fire. And then the last, what we're calling sympathetic joy, is tied to air and wind. Sympathetic joy, I think, as Naoko was saying, these last couple of ones, equanimity and sympathetic joy, don't get practiced as much. Often the focus is more on loving kindness or compassion. And sympathetic joy, I've always found to be kind of an awkward phrasing. And I've read many teachers say, like, that's really not a great translation. But like you were saying about love, Naoko, like, we do not have a good word for this in English, which is quite telling, actually, that we don't have a word for this in English, except I happen to have some friends who are involved in the polyamorous community. And it turns out there's a word in that community for sympathetic joy, basically, which is compersion, compersion. And compersion is if your partner is actually having a pleasure, not just joy, but like having pleasure with another partner, that you can be happy for them, that you can find pleasure in their pleasure. And I feel like that's like the ultimate.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
For a culture that tends towards monogamy, like being able to be like excited for our partner's excitement with someone else is like the next level sympathetic joy.
Right.
But I love that word because then it's like they had to make up a word for this because it does not exist in English. And that's partly because envy gets in the way, right? So envy and jealousy are a feeling of either I want what they have or they have something I should have. And how powerful is it for us to, if we're dealing with envy and jealousy a lot, it doesn't mean we don't feel those things. Like, let ourselves have that feeling. But then in addition, can we also say, I love that for you, right? I love that for you. Like, I love that for you, and I kind of like it for myself, but I also love that for you. And that's what we mean by sympathetic joy. And ultimately, I found that the appreciation that actually is inherent to wanting something, right? So if I want a relationship with someone, if I want a particular job, if I want a book, that wanting comes from appreciation. That's why we feel such joy and excitement about a person or an object or a state of mind. And so if we can come from that place of appreciation, that actually brings a very deep joy that helps liberate us from this state of limited, again, this quality of there's not enough joy to go around, that takes us out of equanimity, that makes us less friendly and that makes it harder for us to experience compassion. So there's actually, I've often found that this joy could be called liberating joy, not just sympathetic joy.
Yeah, this is such, I'm loving this conversation, Miriam, because it's so rich, right? We could just keep talking, I guess. And there's so much more about each of these flavors of love. But I thought we can talk about the practice now to give an idea of how this gets applied.
Yeah.
And also touch on our experience of doing the practice.
Great.
So the practice is applied to different levels of beings. And I'm going to just talk about the really traditional way to practice. And it's actually in 7 steps, usually in this order. So you first start by applying to what we call a benefactor. So that could be a teacher, a mentor, a hero, someone who has guided you, encouraged you, has been a cheerleader for you, right? We start there because it's relatively easy to generate these qualities for someone who really cares about you and who's looked after you. And then the second step is ourselves. So we always include ourselves in this practice because if we can't apply it to ourselves, it's going to be hard to do it for others. And then the third is a beloved. So it could be a family member, it could be your lover, a friend, someone dear to you. So up to now, it seems relatively straightforward, right? And then it becomes a little bit more challenging. So the fourth person is what we call a neutral person, or like strangers, right? People you meet on the streets, you can see them on the streets, people you might sit next to on the plane, the train. You don't know their names, but you see them. Maybe it's someone at work who you've never spoken to, right? And then the fifth person is people we're having difficulty with. So maybe you have a conflict with them. Maybe you've just had an argument with them, right? And then the sixth step is to bring together everyone you've brought to mind so far, right? So you're going to bring them to your circle and you apply the practice to them. Or you could think of a group of people, right? Or it could be a community or an organization. And then the last step is all beings, right? So the idea is that it doesn't matter. It's all sentient beings, everyone is included. So as you can see, this practice can be applied to all relationships. And there's also the sense of expansion, right, of these categories of people we apply. So the practice isn't limited to just the people you know or the people you met. It can really grow into a much bigger practice. And I'm reminded of Bell Hooks, who has an essay called Love as the Practice of Freedom. So I started thinking about how this practice of love can be used to cultivate the sense of collective liberation, of collective freedom. And if you look at the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King, that movement was rooted in the foundation of love. He had the profound insight to see that you can move masses of people for racial justice based on love. That's what touches people. That's what makes people act, right? So, this is so fundamental to being human. So when I first was introduced to this practice, even though these are very profound teachings, I have to say, I was a bit skeptical about whether this was really going to work for me.
Go for it. Be truthful, because I think a lot of people feel that way. Like, isn't this just positive thinking? Yeah.
But then I heard Sharon Salzberg speak at a talk. Now, Sharon Salzberg is a prominent Buddhist teacher and author. She's also very well known for her work on loving kindness. And she talked about the first time she ever did loving kindness practice. And it was at a retreat at the center that they just opened for her Buddhist community. And she started the practice by dedicating the first week of sending herself loving kindness. So she did this all day, right? Reciting, may I be happy, may I be peaceful. And she talks about how she felt nothing. Right. And at the end of the week, something happened in the community and many people had to leave. And she felt really bad because not only did nothing happen, she barely got beyond herself. Right? But as she was preparing to leave the retreat, she accidentally dropped a jar that shattered on the floor. And the first thing she said was, "Oh, you're such a klutz, but I love you." And this surprised her because it was so spontaneous. Typically she would have said something like, "Oh, you're such a klutz, what an idiot." Right? So something happened. There was a change. And this practice is not about making something happen, but with practice, it will become a part of you. Mm-hmm. And something will change inside over time if you stick with it. So this practice is something that I did when my mother got very sick and she was hospitalized. I focused mostly on compassion of the 4 qualities, wishing her to be free from suffering. And my mother passed away, but when I really think about it, it actually helped me a lot to face a very difficult, heartbreaking situation with actually an open heart and equanimity. So that has been my experience doing this practice. And I thought I'd share the story about Sharon, because I think we could all relate to her.
Right, whether or not our mother has passed away. I also appreciate you sharing that personal story. Yeah. And I sometimes say to people, Karuna Training doesn't just work with these 4 limitless ones. We work with lots of other teachings around emotion and compassion as well. But because these pieces float up in formal ways, like the practice that we're going to lead, and also in informal ways, I often tell people that doing these practices saved my marriage. So I've been together with my partner for we were now spouses. We've been together for 17 years. We've been married for 15 years. And we had a rough kind of first half so far, right? So about half of our marriage ago, 7-8 years ago, we had a pretty difficult patch where my spouse was struggling with mental and physical health issues. And I could be a little controlling.
Yes.
Some stuff going on. I'm an entrepreneur. I run my own business. Like, I like things to be a particular way. And just felt like things were a little out of control, and I wanted to control them, and I wanted to change how they operated. I didn't have much. The key thing is that I didn't have really enough appreciation or a sense of equanimity, being able to actually look at them and see them as they are. That was another way that you've described equanimity too, which is like being with things as they are. I wasn't able to be with my spouse as they are. And they were actually able to say to me, I said, like, if this doesn't change, I need to leave. And my spouse answered, if you don't accept that this is just inherently part of how I am, I need to leave. And I was like,
wow. Yeah.
Oh my God. Like, first of all, I thought I'd be the one to say that. But that was like,
wow.
Oh, wow. That really helped a lot. And being able to work with the element of earth and working with equanimity, I'm kind of an earth sign person. I have a lot of, sort of Taurus and a lot of earth in my sign. Generally a pretty grounded person, but it can also get stagnant, right? Where I'm like, I don't want anything to change. I want to be rock solid. And that was like drips of loving kindness, drips of water on the kind of earth, the stagnant earth, that really opened me up so that I could actually accept our situation as is, which, by the way, benefited me. That's part of the power of this practice, is it is so important for us to include ourselves consciously, but also when we do it for others, we benefit ourselves. So by being more accepting of my spouse's anxiety, for instance, I got more accepting of my own anxiety and realized how much of the time I was like not dealing with my own stuff over here and would just project it onto them. Like, I couldn't change myself, but maybe I could change them.
Yeah.
And who needs to be changed here? Maybe neither of us do. And that equanimity, being with it as is, just really, really helps so much for the sustainability of our relationship, really.
Yeah. Yeah. What a great story. And it just really tells you that, well, I guess as with all basic Buddhist teachings, there's a wide application, right? And the four Brahma Viharas can be applied to yourself, to family members, to romantic relationships, to work relationships, like a one-on-one, plus and applied to groups of people, even to a country, to systems, right? There are endless possibilities. And applying some of these four flavors of love to our relationships can sometimes feel quite daunting, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's very hard to wish happiness and joy to someone who's harmed or disregarded you, right? That's a really hard ask. But we just have to remember that these four qualities of love are our very nature. And we can practice them as we are, as you said, right? If we were to put this really simply, I would say that all we really need to do is to want for others what we want for ourselves. You know, in some ways, we're just kind of making space for others. And as you practice, I'm really seeing how each of these four flavors really weave in together, right? And they support one another. So it's not like this linear progression. They're very much connected. They're not separate because they are aspects of the same thing. And lastly, I just want to give an encouragement for everyone who's listening, because maybe you're also still a bit skeptical of this teaching, as I was at first. And I'd just like to offer another translation for Brahma Viharas, which is divine abodes or heavenly abodes. So when you can experience these loves, they say it's like living in heaven right here on earth. So hopefully that is some inspiration for you to explore and practice the four Brahma Viharas.
Thank you. One of the things I love about preparing for this podcast together was just like seeing all of the translations, all of the ways that teachers talk about these teachings and how each of them bring out a different facet of the practice. So we've been talking about a practice. This has been 4 ways to love, 4 different ways in love, 4 aspects of love, faces of love. And we're going to wrap up our conversation here. And then if you're listening to this on or near Valentine's Day, in a couple of weeks, a recording will come out, slightly shorter recording with Naoko and I leading you through the practice. In the meantime, it'd be wonderful if you want to listen to this again, pass it along to someone else, take a look up some of the 4 Brahma Viharas so that you can reflect on some of these ideas yourself. I look forward to talking to you in a couple of weeks.